Never gets old being clapped before you even bloody start. Yeah, thanks for coming along. We've just sat through like a month of hearings of the undercover policing inquiry, which was looking at the 1980s and early 90s. It literally finished like late on yesterday. So I normally pride myself on being quite articulate about this stuff, but I'm kind of running on empty. So apologies in advance if I'm a bit sort of monosyllabic when I'm talking about it. Before we start, are people familiar who the SpyCops were? Yeah, sure, absolutely. So when we talk about the SpyCops, we're talking about two units, a part of Special Branch, the Special Demonstration Squad and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. The Special Demonstration Squad came first. They were formed in 1968. In the May of 1968, there was a really famous, really big protest against the Vietnam War. Took place in Grosvenor Square. Some older heads might even remember it. The police completely lost control that day. Lots of activists managed to surround the US Embassy, and there was like a talk of it being stormed. I mean, that didn't actually happen, but supposedly, I mean, here's one of the things. I mean, I tell this little spiel about the start of the story of the unit. It's kind of based on myth. Like a lot of these things, the people who set these units up were professional liars, and they kind of created their own myths. So there's a guy called Conrad Dixon, who's a senior Special Branch officer, and he goes into a meeting. According to him, this is in his obituary, which he wrote. They like doing that kind of thing. He had a meeting the next day with the Home Secretary, the Commissioner of the Met, and various other senior cops, and said, give me £500,000, 10 good men, and this will never happen again. And they set up what originally they called the Special Operations Squad, but changed to the Special Demonstration Squad, because SDS was the same as Students for a Democratic Society in the US, and the SDS in Germany, which stands for something which I always get wrong because I don't speak German. Anyway, these units were set up. This unit was set up ostensibly to kind of stop the second large anti-Vietnam War demonstration for the October of that year from being as confrontational. They were quite successful in doing that. The demonstration in the October ended up being a show of strength in Hyde Park. Didn't go back to Grosvenor Square, and the large public meeting of all the local anti-Vietnam War groups around the country came to have a large meeting to decide what to do. All 10 of the undercover officers that had been sent into units were at that meeting, voted to go to Hyde Park instead. And the protest went off without a hitch as far as the police were concerned. Now, when we had the first tranche of the inquiry going back last year, the chair then had to give an interim report on, normally public inquiries kind of run for donkey's years before they give any sort of report, but this has been running for so long they had to give an interim report, and he ruled that the unit should have been shut down then, after the initial stopping of the anti-Vietnam War movement from carrying on. It didn't. It continued. They started sending officers undercover into the anti-apartheid movement, into anti-racist groups, into basically anybody on the left, any kind of progressive forces, feminist groups, or basically anything. We kind of started getting within a few years, they'd started a way of building their legend where they would find a dead child, someone who was born around the same time as them, most of the time with the same first name, and they would steal that identity. A lot of people talk about this as they used to take the names of dead children. It's not quite true. They took the name of the child, they took the date of birth, but they also would take everything else. They would go to where the child was born and brought up. They would spy on the family as they were now. They'd work out where they went to school. They'd work out where they might have ended up with a job or whatever, like kind of the life that this child would have had. And then they would combine their own personal stories with the story of this child to create their identity, their legend, which they would use for their undercover deployment. Pretty early on, officers started having sexual relationships with the people they were targeted against. This appears to be a mixture of adding to their legends, getting further intelligence, and just pure sexual gratification for them. Within a few years, the first example we've got in the early 1980s, an officer called Bob Lambert fathered a child. We now know of 4 children that were born of undercover cops going into deployment. Obviously, they were completely fictional people. Their identities weren't real, and they would disappear after a deployment of 5 years, abandoning the child for the rest of their lives. Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of basically who they were. During the first tranche of the inquiry, which was last year, we heard about the officers from the late 60s and the 70s, which is quite interesting. A lot of these officers, they were special branch officers, so they were already political police. I mean, this is a secret undercover political police unit, but they're part of a much bigger, they're publicly known, though with a lot of secrets of its own, political section of the police force. Special branch, if people aren't really fully aware, they do a lot of different things. They do a lot of close protection. They look after prime ministers and foreign dignitaries, as well as celebrities, the rich, basically. But also that's A section. There's industrial sections, and there's C section, which is looking a C squad, which is looking at political activism. I mean, a lot of people think when we talk about undercover police, a lot of the time what they're thinking of is actually plainclothes police. These would be like special branch officers, wouldn't have a fully developed undercover identity, but they'd go along in plainclothes to public meetings, events like this, take notes, report back. So these officers had done that first before they'd been brought in to the SDS. So during the first tranche of the inquiry, we were hearing evidence from these officers, all incredibly bullish. All really felt that, that they hadn't done any harm themselves. The harm had come from this stuff being made public. They were quite angry about this stuff being made public. And this what we've just had now has been the second tranche, the beginning of the second tranche anyway. This was just phase one. There'll be more phases to come. And these officers were even more bullish. A lot of them were much more intelligence cops, I guess. They went from being in the SDS to going on into other aspects of police intelligence and the security services generally. So yeah, that's kind of who these officers are. The level to which they infiltrated groups really varied. So you had some officers who kind of milled around in the background. There's been a bit of a problem with some of the officers when we've identified that a group had an undercover officer in it. We found out their cover name. We don't have their photo. We don't know exactly who they are, but we've got a name and we know the group they were in. And we've contacted people in those groups and they just don't remember them. And we're starting to get a real impression that some of the officers were really complete fantasists and that the reports they were putting in were based on hearsay they were hearing down the pub and they weren't really infiltrating the groups. Other officers went to incredible lengths to basically be the main people within the groups. I mean, he's dead now, but there was an officer called Rick Gibson who infiltrated the Troops Out movement, which was the campaign to not to deploy, originally not to deploy and then to remove British troops from the streets of Britain, basically sending in the army into Northern Ireland in the 1970s, at the start of the Troubles. I mean, he started off as somebody who was sent undercover to infiltrate the Troops Out movement. He ended up forming a new branch, which he was obviously the convener of, and then becoming the convener of the London-wide element of the Troops Out movement, and then becoming the national organizer of the Troops Out movement. So he was literally at the head of the organization. And this sort of getting into, that's quite an extreme example, but we saw a lot of that with the way in which officers would take positions of responsibility. They really liked being like membership secretary or treasurer, things which would give them access to information that they could use in order to fill their reports. They particularly liked the Socialist Workers' Party. The most infiltrated group, 24 undercover officers in the Socialist Workers' Party over the course of their history, which is from 1968 to 2010. I mean, at first it was like, well, what is it about the SWP? I mean, they're quite a big organisation. That kind of would make sense there. It gives lots of connections to the rest of the left, but not necessarily an organisation that's particularly well liked across the left. Certainly a lot of the rest of the left. I mean, speaking as an anarchist, I never had any real time for the SWP. It's actually, just as a quick aside, this is something which happens when you're following the undercover policing inquiry or just following this stuff generally. You kind of see the affinity you've got with everybody else who's against the state, and you start realizing that, in comparison, the differences we've got between the rest of the left are kind of don't really matter that much in comparison to what we're dealing with the state. That's not to downplay any of the criticisms I might have tactically of the likes of the SWP or the Trotskyite left or, last century's left in general and the authoritarian groups that exist within it. But it is something which, kind of does come to mind quite often whilst covering this stuff. But it kind of appears that when we look at their reports, one of the reasons they really liked the SWP was because the SWP kept a lot of lists. If we look at the reports, a lot of the reports, as well as being like this meeting, what happened, this demonstration, what happened, a lot of it is just lists of names, addresses, contact details, appearances, people's appearance, what organizations they're a member of, who else they know. And it's kind of like networking. They're kind of working out the networks, working out who knows who and who's in contact with who, all those kind of what kind of jobs they do. And of course, the SWP not only keeps a list of members, but also lists of potential recruits and lists of people in other organizations. So they love being members of the SWP because they could get access to these lists. And the reports that come from the SWP infiltrators have got, the biggest lists. Sometimes we heard about officers who would go and set up new branches of the SWP, which meant that they could then draw up new lists of potential recruits, which was basically anybody in the left in that local area, and then they could submit these. I mean, there was one example of a guy who set up a branch in Kingston upon Thames, and it only lasted a couple of months. It lasted basically long enough for him to get the full list of potential recruits in the area, submit that report, and then he went to do something else, and the local group didn't really start properly. Yeah, I mean, you get like a lot of this. I apologize. I am jumping around all over the place here with the story. I'm afraid you're going to have to deal with that. When we talk about like kind of what we can learn now about undercover cops, a lot of the tactics will have changed, but this is the thing that doesn't change. This is what they're interested in. It's about the names, the jobs, the contact details of people, who else they know. Because what they were actually doing with this information is blacklisting. They referred to it as vetting, but I mean, it was simply making sure that people who were of the left, in the broadest possible sense, when I say left, I mean it in the broadest possible sense, were not getting any positions of responsibility or influence within the civil service, the BBC, any element of British life that could have like a significant impact. And you see this really kind of, because beyond when the unit was first set up, they had these twin aims of stopping public disorder and subversion. We had a lot of talk at the undercover policing inquiry about what subversion actually means, and there are a few different definitions of it, all of which kind of are slightly different. But rest assured, the undercover police had the widest possible definition they could possibly manage. So it's pretty much anybody. But what really seems that we're fighting against was a change in social attitudes. We heard a lot from the first set of undercover officers who give evidence that there was a lot of long-haired hippie layabouts that needed a good clout. I mean, that's a direct quote. Right, yeah. I mean, it was literally, they were scared of what the new left was presenting in the late 60s, not just for like, let's not go to war in Vietnam, let's oppose apartheid South Africa, all those kind of things, but also just, this. I mean, one of the early groups they infiltrated was the Women's Liberation Front, that was campaigning for the right to women to have bank accounts, and that rape within marriage should be illegal, and that children born out of wedlock should have legal status. Really, really revolutionary, subversive stuff. That, I mean, they had a 10-point program. I don't think you'd find anything in there that would even be considered controversial by someone on the right of British politics right now. I don't know, actually, the right of British politics has got even worse in recent years. Maybe it would. I don't know. But yeah, so I mean, it's kind of this. They're at war with like these social attitudes as much as they are kind of concerned with public disorder. I mean, actually, the thing on the public disorder is quite funny because we heard from a number of other aspects of the police who talked about the SDS reports about potential numbers at demonstrations and the attitude of the crowd was likely to be. And they were just so well out. I mean, they just got it so completely wrong. I mean, as an example, they predict the SDS predicted that the Trafalgar Square poll tax demonstration of March 1990, which is now known as the poll tax riot, would have 5,000 people on it. I mean, it was 250,000 people. I mean, like, you couldn't quite, and you couldn't get it more wrong. I mean, it was quite funny when they did it in that direction. But what you see a lot of, and what's really come out from the last few days of the inquiry, is it happening very strongly in the other way. With like increasingly alarmist reports of plans of extreme violence from groups which, like the Anti-Nazi League. So, for example, in Welling in 1993, there was a protest of what used to get called the BNP Bookshop. I mean, it's a bit of a silly name. It wasn't. I mean, it was the BNP HQ. But I mean, there's only so many copies of Mein Kampf you can sell. Do you know what I mean? Like it.
Any telephone director all around Britain.
Yeah, sure.
BNP number in it. I checked
Yeah. So it was. I mean, it was the BNP headquarters. I mean, like to call it a bookshop is kind of. I mean, if you see pictures of it, it's a bunker essentially. I mean, it was a fortified building, and the reports by Trevor Morris, who was the undercover officer we heard for the last 3 days. I've been listening to his questioning. And I mean, he claimed that the leadership of the Anti-Nazi League were planning on firebombing the building on the morning of the demonstration. He claimed that there was plans for 15. I mean, there was actually 60,000 in the end. He got his numbers quite wrong. He wrote there was 15,000 people who were intent on a violent confrontation with the police in order to attack the bookshop. I mean, I don't know. People might remember what the Anti-Nazi League was like in the 1990s. I mean, this was not. That was not that organisation. But what they were, I mean, from my point of view, I think that physical force anti-fascism is a necessity. I'm sure people disagree with me on that. Certainly the Anti-Nazi League disagreed with me heavily on that. But it didn't do them any good because the police geared up for a riot. There were more mounted horses at Welling in October 93 than there were at Orgreave. People were there described as a medieval battle. The police did repeated baton charges into the crowd who were sat in the road. Very large numbers of people had managed to have very successful claims against the police for getting their heads stoved in. But you really get you really see the link between these fantastical reports that the undercover officers were preparing and the over-policing on the day. So yeah, I mean, this thing of them sort of like preventing public disorder really kind of it has a very different impact to the one that it sounds like they're trying to do. Yeah, I mean, over the last 4 weeks, we've been hearing from a number of undercover officers. It's all been related to the 80s and early 90s. We haven't had any of the animal rights guys yet. There was quite a lot of undercover officers in the animal rights movement during that time period, but the inquiry has split it up into different phases, and that's going to be from this September till December. We'll be hearing from those. So people like Bob Lambert, who people might know, he was the guy who infiltrated the Animal Liberation Front and was responsible for the firebombing of Debenhams in, oh God, I'm going to get the year wrong, so I'm not going to say it. But essentially, very deep undercover. He was involved with London Greenpeace. He had 4 relationships while deployed undercover, including fathering 1 child, who he then abandoned. He went on to lead the unit. We will hear from John Dines, who was also infiltrated London Greenpeace, had a long-term relationship with Helen Steele. He wrote part of, along with Bob Lambert, wrote part of What's Wrong with McDonald's. He also designed, I mean, lots of people might remember this poster, Disarm Authority, Arm Your Desires, with the image of the poll tax riot, with a woman holding an iron bar with a riot cop. It was... Actually, the woman was dobbed in by her mother after that photo went viral. I mean, it was before the days of the internet. After it was splashed all over the tabloid media. And there's a really great song by the Tofu Love Frogs about it, actually, which is a slight aside. Anyway, that poster designed by John Dines, an undercover police officer. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing actually the impact they had in that kind of way of adding to sort of the cultural history of the movement or the movements they infiltrated into. So yeah, we hear from him. We'll be hearing from we're meant to be hearing from John Dines. He now lives in Australia. So if you're not in the country, the inquiry can't compel you to appear. So he probably won't appear. We have actually heard from some other undercover officers who are meant to give evidence at the inquiry, who were called to appear and replied that if they were forced to appear, they'd kill themselves. So the judge didn't... sounds awful, right? So they've got a terrible mental health problem. Interestingly, the first officer to say this was... So we don't know, most of them we don't know their names. Some of them we know their cover names, but some of them we don't even know their cover names. We've just got a cipher to refer to them as. So this is a guy called HN109. I've got a whole bunch of HN numbers in my head. It means very little to people who aren't following it, so bear with me. But HN109 was head of the unit in the early 90s. There was one of the undercover officers, HN56, who was one of the very, very few who infiltrated the far right. I'll come back to him in a minute. But he had a mental health problem. And went to HN109, who just said, this is just made up. There's no such thing as mental health. Another one of the officers, HN95, Stafford Scutt, who lives abroad now. I mean, he completely went off the rails. I mean, his story is wild. What did I say? Stafford. Oh, God, yeah, that's not Stafford Scott. That's a very different person. It was a good comrade who's got far too similar a name, and I'm liable to, follow myself. Anyway, so... Stefan Scutt, who completely went off. He was meant to be infiltrating Hackney, the SWP, but in reality, he seemed to be involved in serious organised crime in Norfolk at the same time. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting characters in this. Anyway, I mean, he went completely off the rails, disappeared, and was found sleeping rough in York Minster 4 days later. Really weird. Anyway, I mean, HM109 worked really hard to make sure that he didn't get any compensation for the mental health crisis that he'd gone through whilst deployed, and said there's no such thing as mental health. Now he's claiming he'd kill himself because of his mental health problems if he's called to the inquiry. Strangely enough, I haven't got a lot of sympathy for him. I really think he should be called and let the coins fall where they may. But anyway, we've had a number of undercover officers who've been given evidence in this set of hearings who've come up with some stuff which we didn't know before. But nothing's really changing for how we see the sort of the general kind of thing of the unit. I've kind of been all over the place. If there's anybody who's got any questions, if they want to like put their hands up, I'll take any questions at any time and I'll kind of go back to it.
The infiltrations were mainly on the left, but you did touch that there were right-wing infiltrations as well.
Yeah, so we heard from the first officer to infiltrate the far right, HN56, who gave evidence last Wednesday. So just to set the scene, you know, as I said, most of the undercover officers were going undercover 5 years at a time, delivering really regular reports into the groups they were infiltrating. The groups they were infiltrating tend to be quite active groups that were known to the police already, and there was these shopping lists from MI5 that were given to SDS officers of information they wanted to know particularly about groups. So it was particularly, you know, what's this person's address, where does this person work, this kind of very specific information. We see this first undercover officer into the BMP. He's sent into a group that's no longer active, hasn't been active for a year or so, but the members are still around, they're drinking in a particular pub, it's their local. And he goes to this pub and drinks in this pub for about 10 months. In the first 4 months, he puts in 2 reports, both of which could have been written by reading the British Nationalist newspaper. There was nothing particularly of interest in there. He goes on one serious national meeting and to one Rights for Whites march before he appears to be absolutely terrified and withdraws. He says the reason he's so terrified is that he believes that other members of Special Branch who are sympathetic to the BMP are going to out him whilst he's deployed. So he's in for a very short period of time. There's no real depth to his infiltration, and then he leaves quite suddenly. Now, supposedly there are other undercover officers who infiltrated the BMP, but we know very little of them. As I said, we know, like, for some officers, we've got their real name, we've got their cover name. Others, we've just got their cover name. Others, we've just got this cipher. But there are a number of undercover officers. We haven't been told what they're infiltrated into. We've literally been told nothing about them because the level of anonymity and secrecy and privacy that they've received is so high. I mean, it's quite disgusting when you consider that on our side, there are people whose lives have been completely destroyed, who've infiltrated for years, have had children by these men, and they are not getting any privacy whatsoever. They've got no anonymity, very little anonymity. There's a certain level of it. But yeah, these officers who we know absolutely nothing about really, supposedly some of them may have been infiltrating the far right. But it's hard to know, were they the same as HN56? Were they going deeper? Given his fears about being outed, were they the people he was worrying would out him? It's really hard to tell. What we do know is that for the vast majority of its history, the SDS didn't infiltrate the far right. Certainly in the 1970s, there was a conscious decision not to, because it was decided that the National Front weren't a problem. I mean, like, for those of you who remember the 1970s, the fire bombings, the murders that took place, but as far as the police were concerned, the National Front were the organisation that was planning marches. They were cooperating with the police in the planning of those marches. And, you know, it was the anti-fascists. So we heard a lot of undercover officers say, well, they weren't a problem. It was the anti-fascists who were the problem. And it's because of the way in which they interacted with the cops, but also their ideology, right? There was a lot of sympathy for their ideology. Not just the fascism and the racism, but also like the loyalism. They still believed in Queen and country. And that really seems to matter a lot. These undercover officers. I mean, one of the most common phrases we'd hear from these undercover officers giving evidence is about the protecting the Queen's peace. And they say it in this really reverent way. They really feel they've got some sort of direct relationship. I think because a lot of special branch officers work in protection, they're very close, like physically close to like rich and powerful people. And they really feel an affinity for them, despite the fact that, you know, They don't give a fuck about them. Like they really, like the rich and powerful don't care about these men at all. But they've got that kind of that Stockholm syndrome that kind of you kind of get from like those kind of those old butlers who kind of feel they're part of the family, but really they're just part of the furniture. I mean, you get that sort of mentality coming from these special branch officers. I can't remember where I was going with that, but yeah. Any more questions? Dave.
Just wanted to add a few things.
Of course you did.
Fantastic introduction.
This is Dave Morris, who's also a co-participant at the Undercover Policing Inquiry and a hero.
Sorry. Anyway, Tom's done a brilliant overview, but we could both talk for like hours about this, days in fact. But I want to say a few things. First of all, the first undercover officer to be outed was Mark Kennedy, who was involved with the Green Gathering.
He was, yeah.
And he ran the bar and...
Last Chance Saloon.
People think he deliberately bankrupted and got the police to kind of like prevent future Green gatherings. So and he was an utter bastard. He had relationships with lots of women, and he was the first one to be outed. Now, when he was outed, this was about
2010.
2010. It was called "That's Just One Bad Apple," and then other women worked really hard to trace people that had disappeared, who turned out to be ex-police. How many women now?
60.
60 women.
60 women, yeah. So far, who've been willing to come forward. There are a number of other women who are affected who decided not to come forward, but there's 60 people who are willing to identify
other women
themselves.
Who don't even know yet.
Yeah,
because we don't know all the cover names of all these officers. But it was the women who started campaigning collectively, saying it's not one bad apple, this whole operation was sick. And then it was a police officer who was in that unit decided to turn whistleblower.
Peter Francis. Yeah.
Peter Francis turned whistleblower, and he said that the SDS that he worked for were trying to smear the Stephen Lawrence campaign, the campaign for justice for their murdered son, who was murdered by racists, and then the police covered up the murder. So that really forced the government to institute this public inquiry. A public inquiry is quite a big deal. They've already spent over £80 million on this public inquiry, and the police have spent £60 million defending themselves. So I'm just trying to add a few fill in a few gaps. That's why we've got a public inquiry. It is a big deal. We're getting tens of thousands of secret reports from this previously secret unit, and almost all of them were sent at the time to MI5. So there's a much bigger picture here in terms of they're not just infiltrating groups, they're reporting on people. Like you say, it's for vetting purposes, but also they're trying to identify potential informants and also smear campaigns. Getting information on groups where they can use to maybe undermine them if they become super, effective as campaign groups. And I'll ask Tom in a minute to say what we've actually heard on that, informants and smear campaigns this week. But let me just finish off while I've got the platform. 1,000 groups, they monitored about 1,000 groups, maybe 200, 300 were actually infiltrated, and others were reported on through that infiltration. So it's quite extensive over 40, 50 years. Just I want to say a couple of other things. First of all, what's coming out of these reports is these great movements that we've all been part of over the decades, doing really good things that were publicly popular. All right, we meant not all the groups were big groups, but these campaigns, anti-apartheid, anti-racism, feminism, challenging police accountability groups, left-wing groups, trade union disputes and so on. These are great movements that we can all learn from. They were tried to undermine, but actually they failed to undermine them, and we've gone on from strength to strength. But finally, I want to say they've begun to make loads of apologies. Yeah, they've apologised for the women that were being targeted for sexual abuse and relationships. They've now apologised only a couple of weeks ago for targeting anti-racist groups and family justice campaigns, police accountability campaigns. They're basically saying should not have been doing that. And we believe we're going to get some more apologies by the end of this inquiry. Okay, thank you.
I mean, quite interestingly, like just on the apology thing, we heard from Trevor Morris for the last 3 days of the inquiry. He showed quite a lot of emotion at one point in the inquiry. He had the most recent apology read to him after we'd gone through about the sexual relationships that he had, where he was completely unrepentant and claimed that he was the real victim because he had to pretend to be somebody else. Whereas these women, with who they were, how could they have been upset by it? They knew they got on with me. They liked me. But he was then read the apology. He was asked if he agreed with it, and he said no. It was unacceptable. It was outrageous. That the apology was outrageous and unacceptable. How dare they? How dare the Commissioner of Police apologise for this? That really gives you, that's not an uncommon view amongst the officers. We heard it in Tranche 1, where someone blamed the inquiry for causing upset to the families of the dead children, because otherwise they would have never known. So there was no harm done by them. He didn't do any harm by stealing this dead child identity, spying on the parents, following them round. That wasn't any harm at all. What was harm was the inquiry informing them that their child's identity had been stolen. Oh, the smear. Yeah, I mean, we had a bit from Trevor Morris where he was put to him that he was, because Peter Francis had worked with him, that Peter Francis was asked to collect information to smear the Lawrence campaign, and Trevor Morris went, "That's ridiculous. The Special Demonstration Squad didn't do smears. We just collected intelligence. The security services, they do the smears. Let them do that, not us." I mean, there's a very close relationship between the two. I mean, he's wrong. It's not true. The SDS did do smears. But the security services do a lot of smears as well. And we know the relationship between the security services and the SDS was one of a customer relationship. They were giving them these shopping lists of information they wanted to know, which they were then, we can just see in the reports, because you've got these memos, you've got these reports, and they're answering the questions. It's very clear. The idea that, oh no, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just passing it to someone else, and it's the same logic we hear from arms dealers, isn't it? Yeah.
Can I quickly ask, what do you mean by security services? Oh,
right. So MI5, basically, a box 500 in the in internal terms of basically you'd have these reports and they would have a list on there of where they were being sent to, and box 500 would be one of them. Would be the most common place they got sent to. Box 500 is what we know as MI5. But when they say the security services, sometimes it's one of these things, right? There's certain terminology that they use. It may include other sections of the security services, but overwhelmingly it's MI5.
And I hoped you could just speak a bit more to outline why exactly people were spied on. I mean, you touched on it, and you did earlier as well. But particularly, now there's an inquiry. How do they justify? You said about keeping the Queen's peace, but given that officers have been part of obviously fomenting violence within movements, and given that they're not spying on those movements which are the most violent and most threaten peace, in more detail, are there sort of 5 core objectives, or
Yeah, I mean, there's one real core objective. I mean, basically, Britain, like most of the world, is run by a very small group of incredibly rich, powerful psychopaths who want to control the world for their own means. The idea that working class people should have any sort of political representation, voice, or political agency is an anathema to the system we live under. So they build an infrastructure of repression in order to prevent ordinary people from influencing how society is run in any way. I mean, just on that violence thing, I mean, if any political movement was genuinely violent, the SDS wouldn't touch them. That was somebody else's job as far as they were concerned. They were specifically interested in the kind of groups who standed outside shops holding banners or giving out leaflets. It's about the repression of political expression and political agency.
And they name that openly?
No, it's subversion is the term they use. But when you look at what the definitions of subversion are and the multiple different definitions that they use, that's basically what they mean.
Thank you for that great talk. And you said 40 or 50 years this has been going on, which coincidentally is the length of time that the Green Movement has been in existence.
Right.
And we've got to ask ourselves always why we haven't been more successful in achieving our goals. And obviously this is one of the reasons. What do we do now to just kind of, we've now got to somehow trace back who was subverting our messages and how, so that we can kind of reset ourselves on the course that we should have been on all along.
Yeah.
And and this has been going on in Britain, in America, in Europe, And, I've written articles about it as a journalist as well in the States. And it's very serious because we've now got, we are at the moment where our ideas must take hold and they can't be subverted again. Now we have a whole new generation of corporations coming in telling us they're going to sort it all out for us. Same thing is going to happen again. How do we get back to the right message, the one that's going to convince, the Reform Party, people who voted for Reform last election?
I mean, personally, I don't think it's ever got anything to do with optics. I think that, like you say, the Green Movement's gone about 50 years. I think that the message of the Green Movement 50 years ago was perfectly good. I don't think the message was ever the problem. It's the action, it's the ability to mobilise, and it's the ability to be confrontational. I think when we look at the way in which the police were most determined to take down movements, were the most confrontational. And I think, obviously I'm coloured by my own personal politics. I'm an anarchist. But I think that it's about keeping on, right? It's about keeping going. It's about doing the same things, because despite the fact that they infiltrated these movements, we have had quite a lot of successes over the years. It might not feel like it very often, but actually we do win things. And there's a lot of things that don't happen because of the involvement of people from our movements. And we've just got to keep doing them, despite the fact that they're sending undercover officers, because the dirty tricks just get worse, right? The more successful you are, the more effective you are, the more dirty it gets and the worse they'll be. And we shouldn't never let ourselves be caught up in thinking that we need to be reasonable or respectable, or get caught up in if only we could articulate ourselves a bit nicer and win people over through the correct way of saying things. Society is not a debating chamber. It's a power struggle, and we need to treat it like that. And that means being confrontational, to my opinion. I think when I say confrontational, there's a lot of ways to being confrontational. I'm not asking everybody to go out and fight. I'm not saying that at all. But I think it's not about getting the words right. I think we got the words right a long time ago.
Thank you, Tom. I'm really pleased to see you here. I'm Brig Ubridge. I used to be director of the Big Green Gathering. Yeah. Dave mentioned earlier how the first of the undercover cops to be unmasked was Mark Kennedy, who was one of his deployments was running the transport for the bar at the Big Green Gathering. At the time, we put in an application to be a recognised party at the public inquiry, and we were turned down. I didn't pursue it because the whole bankrupting of the Big Green Gathering had bad effects on my mental health, and I wasn't going to commit myself to 15 years of trying to follow a public inquiry, and thank you for doing it. But as someone who hasn't been following it, I'd really like to know if anything has come out about the details of whatever reports Mark Stone was submitting to ACPO and the chief police officers at the time when Avon and Somerset Police decided to take down the Big Green Gathering.
Basically, because the way in which the inquiry is structured, it's doing it in a historical linear process. So we're only up to 93 at this point. So we're a bit of a way off from coming to that stuff. But it's interesting because it's not an unusual thing for the police to do, to take down cultural events. The Big Green Gathering was a lot more than just a cultural event, right? It was a really key part, I think, for a lot of us in the Green Movement, for networking, for campaigning. But they really they saw cultural institutions. I was part of a vegan group, and that was infiltrated. It was an eat out vegan group in Wales. There was a lot of targeting of organisations that, to the outsider, might be considered not particularly political, because they saw it as part of a wider culture that they were looking to undermine. So we haven't got any detail of that coming out yet. I would say I think you were probably right not to spend years head banging the wall for getting involved, because there's people who have got core participant status who have had very little impact into how the inquiry is run. Over the last few weeks, we've had a number of situations where we've had undercover officers who a large part of their reporting is related to individuals who have got core participant status who the inquiry is not calling to give evidence. So we heard from Roger Pierce, who infiltrated anarchist groups in the early 80s. He got very close to a guy, Dave McNabb, who was at the inquiry the other day. He's a co-participant at the inquiry. His name was being said all the time during the evidence. He wasn't called to give evidence. I mean, Dave Morris, who did give evidence, and Steve Sorber from Friends of Freedom Press did give evidence. Both of them were saying, you should ask Dave. He's in the room. You should ask Dave. The inquiry wasn't asking Dave. We had the thing on Greenham Common. There was a couple of people who gave evidence about that, about the undercover officers who infiltrated that. Rebecca Johnson from the Greenham Women was in the room, had applied to be a co-participant, was refused. Her name was coming up constantly. We were seeing photographs of her on the screen. You know, Hilary Moore, who was giving evidence, said, you should ask Rebecca. She'll know. Should ask Rebecca. You know, Jane Hickman from Hickman Rose was giving evidence. She was like, ask Rebecca. She's by there. She's over there. Ask Rebecca. She'll be able to answer it properly for you. They didn't call Rebecca. We've had, over the last few days, we had a huge amount being said about Chris Bambury from the SWP. He's still politically active with Counterfire. There was a load of accusations that he was involved in some very extreme violence, organising very extreme violence. He's been given no right of reply on that. He hasn't been called at all. I mean, he didn't bother applying to be a co-participant. I don't blame him. It's clearly not worth it. It's asymmetrical, the relationship that the non-state co-participants have with the inquiry. There's some pretty grotesque stuff. One of the women who was deceived into a long-term relationship by Andy Coles, the brother of the Reverend Richard Coles from the Communards, who was an undercover police officer who infiltrated animal rights groups in the late 80s, early 90s. He deceived a woman called Jessica into her first ever serious relationship. When she was 19 years old. He was in his early 30s, though pretending to be much younger. She went to the police and made an official complaint of rape initially and had like a 5-hour interview. The footage of that interview was then given to him so that he could write his written statement for the inquiry. It was given to him by the inquiry. She still hasn't had disclosure of his documents about her that are like 30 years old. I don't blame anybody for not getting involved in the inquiry. Because, I mean, so far, every deadline, every date that the inquiry has ever given us has turned out to be, incredibly optimistic on their behalf. The last government said that the inquiry had to be finished by October 2026, and supposedly that's still the deadline. There's no way. I mean, we spent so many years with just dealing with police applications for anonymity. The police put in, 3 judicial reviews of the process. There's been feet dragging in extremis. So I mean that's why, even though it was called in 2015, it only actually started sitting in 2020, and then we've had huge gaps of 12 months in between sets of hearings. So the idea, I mean, they're now saying April will be the beginning of tranche 3, but also they said there was going to be 3 months more of hearings for tranche 2, which are now we've got 2 months worth booked in supposedly for September to late November, early December. That's not enough time. They'll have to do some more in the new year. That's probably going to push back. It's all taking an incredibly large amount. People say that public inquiries are a banquet for lawyers. There's a lot of lawyers involved. There's a lot of on all sides. I mean, there's some of the best lawyers, human rights lawyers in the country are involved in this, representing people on our side. But there's a whole lot of incredibly evil lawyers on their side as well.
We have a question at the back.
Sorry, 3 questions, but quickly.
Okay.
Thanks. So you mentioned apologies. Are we expecting anything else? Is anything else going to, apart from that's it? All these lawyers and all this, that's going to be it.
I mean, so people have brought civil claims. I was one of the people who brought civil claims right at the beginning of this process. Some women who were deceived into long-term relationships and had children by these officers have had some level of compensation, out-of-court settlements. One person got a proper settlement through the Investigative Powers Tribunal, which is Britain's most secretive court. That was incredible. I mean, if I tried, I could explain that to you, but we might be here for another 2 hours. But Kate Wilson, which is an incredible feat to do that. The Investigative Powers Tribunal has a 98.7% failure rate. So it was incredible that she managed to get a good result with that. But basically no. Nobody will ever be held responsible.
Do we know about all of the people that were deployed?
No.
And going forwards, do we know whether there's anything replacing it? Are we assuming that groups are still getting infiltrated, and have we got any?
So yes, almost. So I mean, when the National Public Order Intelligence Unit was wound up after the exposure of Mark Kennedy, ACPO merged. This is where I get into the Association of Chief Police Officers. There's a lot of alphabet soup in all this world, but they they merged the National Public Order Intelligence Unit with the Animal Rights. Can you remember the National Index? That's it. The Animal Rights National Index, and a third bit of alphabet soup that I forget. That ended up as part of CO11, which is counterterrorism. So we know that there is the continued use of covert policing methods in order to monitor what they would call extremist groups. Obviously, like, none of the desk work, as they call it, of the Special Branch was ever disrupted in any way like this. The disruption purely came for the long-term undercover deployments. So there's lots of other tactics that have remained unbroken. Certainly, as well, since 2010, we've seen a real change in the police force. It's become, neoliberal policing has become the normality now, right? Police use a lot of outside contractors in order to fulfill a lot of roles, everything from front of desk in police stations to doing all sorts of aspects. So the use of infiltrators, informers, and like grasses, if you like. Dave mentioned earlier about informers. We heard a lot of information about when one of the officers, it was put to him that he was collecting very personal, private information about people, people described as practicing homosexuals, particularly those in the closet. They were quite excited by that information because they had an opportunity to turn them. And he said, oh, well, this information was good. Yes, it's personal and private information. That's exactly what I was out to collect, because it's really use of information for turning people into informers. So there's a heavy use of that sort of thing. We know that the criminal informer database has grown exponentially over the last 10 years. I mean, obviously it's a different thing, but we would imagine that in political movements that would have grown in the same sort of rate. And of course, there's the whole huge area of electronic surveillance, which has improved massively. And I think a lot of people quite misunderstand that. They think of that in terms of algorithms and stuff, but actually we're talking about large numbers of special branch officers at desks, using a combination of CCTV and backdoors into social media and all these sorts of things to have a very full picture. So I mean, you'll hear desk officers say that they infiltrated a group, and they never actually physically infiltrated the group, but to all intents and purposes, they'd infiltrated the groups.
I guess slightly similar to that question, but at the present and going forward, kind of, what do you suggest with movements and how to respond to feeling threatened by undercover police? And also, I guess, is there any chance ever of lots of that information coming out?
Yeah, I mean, it would be amazing to think that we could have that like fall of the Stasi moment where everybody gets their files. I don't think that's very likely in Britain. The registry files, which all this information was going into, are incredibly secret. None of them are being opened for the purposes of the inquiry. I think that's probably unlikely. In terms of what movements should do now, in terms of like kind of not being affected by it, I think first and foremost is what I was saying earlier. It's like keep on doing it, keep on campaigning despite this sort of stuff. I mean, that's the most important thing, is to keep engaged and to not let yourself kind of be cowed into submission with it. I think because the tactics will change, we can't really do much about the way in which they act. We've got a guide, Was My Friend a SpyCop? You can download the PDF. I've normally got copies, but I've given them all out now. And it's like 15 questions to identify if somebody was an undercover police officer. But it's very historic. Things will have changed. But what we know for sure is the information that they want to collect, and also the tactics they use to destabilise and undermine groups, because a big part of their role was destabilising and undermining groups. And a lot of that was achieved through like gossip and scandal and internal dynamics, denouncing people for the people not quite getting things right politically, or using the wrong terminology, or being on the wrong side of like what is often in retrospect a minor disagreement politically within a group, which really tears groups apart. We saw reports of 6 and 7 hour meetings where people were being denounced and like asked to do what they call it, self-criticism, where they would like kind of say, yes, I'm a racist, because of something very minor, and you're like, God, this huge levels of internal trauma, because really the undercover police really dealt in trauma. They used trauma as part of their legend building, or part of the withdrawal, and the way in which they interacted with groups, partially in order to get empathy, to like to emotionally bond with people, but also to disrupt and undermine groups. And I think you don't have to be an undercover police officer to engage in that kind of behaviour. I think there's a lot of people who engage in that kind of behaviour in political movements who aren't undercover police, but it's equally damaging. And I think that the key takeaway we can have is like, let's not do that. Let's not turn in on each other.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions, mainly about vetting and, well, smearing. I think you partly answered that, but yeah, vetting. It would be good to elaborate on that. I know that the BBC had an office where they would vet people, that's sort of public knowledge. But have you got any other evidence where people's careers have been impacted from the inquiry?
So, I mean, there have been a number of people. Richard Chesham, who was somebody who was targeted by Rick Gibson, who I mentioned earlier, the Troops Out movement. He was somebody who's very blatantly was blacklisted from all the kind of work that he did for, I think it was like 18 years. He just couldn't get a job, which was kind of weird given his experience and CV. We saw it a lot in the construction industry. I mean, there's a book, The Blacklist by Dave Smith, which I really recommend, which goes into great detail about the way in which private organisations who had a revolving door relationship with Special Branch and the Special Demonstration Squad, the Consulting Association, and I forget the other one's called, Economic League, who large. I mean, the bits we know about is from a raid on their offices, which took one filing cabinet, and the rest of it got burnt the next day by the organisation because. And so what we know about is the blacklisting of health and safety officers within other reasons as well, like trade unionists. But the big one was health and safety officers within the construction industry who were removed essentially from the industry because they were costing it too much. It's a huge area. There's a lot of evidence for it.
So I'm not sure what a public inquiry, I mean, I know about courts where you've got a judge. Presumably somebody's making decisions about who speaks and how does it actually operate, and is there any punishment at the end of this, or is it just this is the information, the press ignore it, we carry on? Yeah,
I mean, you've answered the second part of the question there. In terms of how it works, there's a judge, a very senior judge generally. When this process first started, we had Lord Justice Pitchford as head of the inquiry. He was a retired law lord, very respected. He died. He had MS. And it was passed then to just a mere Sir. We've gone from a law lord to a knight. We've got Sir John Mitting, who was a bit less respected, shall we say, who's the chair of the inquiry now. He's guided by the counsel to the inquiry, which is a group of lawyers who formulate the questions that are put to the witnesses. They select the witnesses from the list of core participants, both state and non-state core participants, and the other lawyers who are representing individuals have an opportunity to make opening statements, closing statements, and submit questions to the counsel to the inquiry to ask of the witnesses that are brought forward. The information is then put together for a narrative account and a learning the lessons. There's a proper term for it, I can't remember, but recommendations. I told you I've literally 4 weeks to the inquiry. I'm exhausted. I'm not very articulate today. But so the recommendations, these would relate to things like training and for the police to learn lessons of. I think I've got to the end. I will be back at 7 o'clock. We're showing a new film, The Police Spies Who Ruined Our Lives. I would do a Q&A around that as well later on. So if anybody's got any more questions, come and see me. Though actually right now, the next talk over in the campaign's marquee is about the death of Moeed Bashir, who was one of my neighbours who was murdered by police a couple of years ago. I'd really recommend people go to that if they've got time. But campaign.